Hi guys, I Aziz welcome you to CoedMaster. In this video, I will talk about this keyword in JavaScript. This keyword in JavaScript is one of the most confusing topic of the JavaScript that even seasoned JavaScript developers sometimes fails to guess the correct value of this keyword. In this video, I will make sure to explain you everything about this keyword so that you can determine the value of this keyword very easily. We will dive deep into the concept of this keyword where we will learn what this keyword actually is, what is the function call stack and what is the significance of it, what are the 4 rules we can apply to determine the value of this keyword. So my friend, by the end of this video, you will be equipped with all the knowledge required to deal with this keyword. So without wasting any time, let's get started. Alright guys, so let's start with the very first question, that what this keyword actually is. So let me answer this question with just 3 points. So point number 1, this keyword in JavaScript is a special identifier keyword that's automatically defined in the scope of every function. Now, how the scope of every function is defined, that we will discuss in the next slide. Okay. Point number 2, as this is a identifier keyword, which means this always refers to some value. Okay. Now what is that value? We will discuss again in the next slide. Okay. And the third point is, this is not an author time binding but a runtime binding. What does it mean? So it basically means the value of this is not decided by the programmer who is writing the code, right? The value of this is decided by the JavaScript runtime. That is why we can say that it is not an author time binding, instead it is a runtime binding. Great. So far so clear. So let me recall. So basically this is a special identifier keyword which is defined automatically in the scope of every function. And this always refers to some value and it is always a runtime binding. Okay. So the value of this is always determined at the time of runtime. Great. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, we understood what this keyword actually is. Now, how this keyword is actually created, let's understand in this slide. So what happens when the function is invoked, right? Because we learned in the previous slide that this keyword is created in the scope of every function, right? So how this keyword is actually created? So let's understand what happens when we invoke a function. So as soon as we invoke any function, the activation record or execution context is created. And while the execution context is created, that execution context stores some information about the function. For example, it stores where the function was called from, and we call it a call site, means the location of the function from where it is being called. Okay. The next thing the execution context store is how the function was invoked, which means are we using any object to invoke the function or we are directly invoking the function. Okay. The third thing it stores is what are the different parameters the function is expecting, or what are the different arguments we are passing to that function. Okay. And apart from all of this information, this is also created, which means that this keyword is also created, and that this keyword will be used throughout the execution of that function. Okay, which means the lifespan of this keyword is until the function is executed. Okay, so when we invoke the function, one execution record, or we can say normal record, activation record is created, and when the activation record stores all of this information, with that information this keyword is also created, and this keyword is also stored in that execution context. Great. So far so fine. So now we know what this keyword actually is and how this keyword is created. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now here we will answer the simple question that why we even need this keyword. Can't we write the JavaScript code without this keyword? The answer is absolutely yes. We can write JavaScript code without this keyword, but this keyword has amazing significance. Okay, let's understand this with a simple example. So let's see the left side code over here. So here we have a function identify, and that function is expecting one argument or parameter. We call it context, and below that function we have two objects, me and you, and in the last I am logging the value of calling the identify function, and similarly I'm calling again the identify function with a different object. Okay, now when we call the identify function by passing the me, what will be the value? It is very simple. So in the first statement we are invoking the identify function by passing the me as the context, right? And inside the identify function we are calling context dot name dot to uppercase. So obviously the me object has a name property, so it will take out the Aziz from there and then it will convert into uppercase and it will log the message in the console, as simple as that. Similarly, in the next statement we are calling identify function by passing the u object to that function, and similarly it will take out the name, which is a John, and then it will convert into the uppercase and then it will log the message in the console, as simple as that. So this is a very simple example. Now in this example we are not leveraging the concept of this, which is why we have to explicitly pass the context into this function. Now let's take the another example, which is an enhanced version of this function, where we will be leveraging the concept of this keyword. Okay, so in this example also, on the right side we have the same function, same object and same console statement, but you can see the difference that this time we are not directly invoking the identify function. So what we are doing, we are accessing the call method of the identify function, and in that call function we are passing the value of this. Okay, in the first statement the value of this is going to be the me, in the second statement the value of this keyword is you. Now when we execute or when we invoke this function, the JavaScript runtime itself determines the value of this, and we are telling JavaScript engine that please use the value of this as the me object, and in the second statement please use the value of this as the you object. Okay, so when we invoke identify function, that this keyword in the first statement, that this keyword refers to me object, where we have a name property and the value of name property is Aziz, and it will be converted to uppercase and then it will be printed on the console. Similarly, the John will be printed on the console in the second statement. Okay, now you will be asking that what's the difference? We can write the code with explicitly passing the context in the function, but here we are not passing the explicitly context, but still it is working fine. Now you can imagine that you are working on a very large code base where you have a lot of function. Now if you follow the left approach, then you end up writing a lot of functions which is expecting the context, and you have to manually pass context all the time, and this ultimately makes your code messier and very extremely difficult to maintain. Now what is the advantage of this here? So basically this mechanism of JavaScript provides a more elegant way of implicitly passing along an object reference, right? So basically we are not explicitly passing the object, but we are implicitly passing the object, and it provides a more elegant way to write a code which is more cleaner and more maintainable and which is more reusable. So this is a one use case of this keyword. There are many use cases of this keyword. So I just took the one use case so that you can understand that why even we need this keyword. Okay, great. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now in this slide we will understand what does it mean by the call site. Now you would be asking, Aziz, why we are learning about call site? So my friend, in order to determine the value of this keyword, the only thing matters is the call site of the function and the 4 rules that we will discuss in a bit. Okay, and what is the call site? The call site basically means the location where the function is being called. Okay, so let's understand the concept of call site using this example. Okay, so let's see this example. In this example we have 3 functions, baz, bar and foo. Okay, so this is the script, and we are first calling the baz function on the root level of the script. Okay, so what is the call site for the baz? So the call site for the baz is the root level script, correct? Now let's go inside the baz function. What is there in our call stack now? So before initially the call stack is empty, but we invoke one function. So in our call stack we have one function, and that function is baz. Okay, now what is the call site of the bar? Now what is the call site of the baz function? It's the global scope, because we invoke that function on the root level of the script. Okay, then we are logging the baz, and then again we are calling the bar. Now what is the call site of the bar? The call site of the bar is the bars function, right? Now let's go inside the bar. Now on the call stack, initially before we had bars, now we have bars and then bar. Okay, so our call site is in the bars, means the call site of the bar is in bars. Okay, then we are consoling the bar value, and then again inside the bar as a last statement we are calling or invoking foo function, and that would be the call site of the foo. Okay, now let's go inside the foo function. You can see that now our call stack includes bars, bar and then foo, correct? And the call site for the foo is bar, and then we are simply logging the statement on the console. So this is how you can see that the call site for the bars is the global scope, the call site for the bar is bars, and the call site of the foo is bar. That's it. This is what you need to understand, that how the call site can be determined. Okay, and what is the exact location of the function where it is being called. Now we will use the concept of call site in the upcoming slides. Okay, just remember this thing, that the only thing matters for this keyword is the call site and the 4 rules. Okay, now let's move on to the next slide, where we will discuss the 4 rules which we can apply to determine the value of this. And these 4 rules are: first one is the default binding of the this, second rule is the implicit binding of this, third rule is the explicit binding of this, and the fourth rule is the new binding of this. Now let's understand all of these binding or rules one by one in the next slide. Okay, great. So first let's discuss what does it mean by default binding of this. So let's understand this with this example. So in this example you can see that we have one function foo, and we have defined one variable a with a value 2, and then in the last statement we are invoking the function foo. Now guess what will be the value of console.log statement here. Okay, so as you can see that the console.log statement will print 2 in the console, but you have to understand why the value 2, why not other value. Okay, so let's understand. So as you can see, this is a script, right? And we are invoking the function at a global scope. Why global scope? Because we are invoking the function at the root level of the script. And if you know carefully, in JavaScript, what is the global scope? What's the object which refers the global scope? That is a window. Okay, so when we define the foo function and a variable a, it gets automatically added to the global scope, which is a window. Okay, and when we invoke the function at a root scope level or in the global scope, the JavaScript engine determines the value of this, and it assigns or it assigns the value of a global object to this. So this time the this inside the foo function refers the window object, and as we have defined the variable a is equal to 2, it gets defined in the global object of window. So now this refers to the window object. Window object has a and the value of a is 2. That's why a gets the value of a, which is equal to 2, gets printed on the screen. So this is the default binding of this keyword. So when we invoke the function at the root level of the script, the value of this will refers to the global object, and that is a window object. Okay, so this is the default case. Now what happens when you are running the script in a strict mode? So in that case the behavior is little bit different. So in that case, instead of assigning the window to this keyword, the JavaScript runtime assigns the undefined to this keyword. Okay, so if you are using the strict, if you are running the code in the strict mode, the value of the this is going to be, the value of this in the default binding is equal to be undefined, and when you call undefined.a, then it will, JavaScript engine will yell at you that this is a type error, you are not able to call a on undefined, correct? So this is how the default binding of this keyword works. Okay, now let's move on to the next slide, where we will learn how implicit binding of this works. Okay, now let's see this example. In this example we have a function, simple function, and below this function we have an object obj, and now we have created one property foo, and then we have assigned the function to that property. So basically the foo function resides in the obj object, right? Now To invoke the obj function, we are taking the help of obj object. So now we are invoking function with the help of object. So we are saying obj.foo, and this time you can guess that what will be the value of this. So as we are invoking function with the help of the object, which means the obj object is the containing object or the owning object, which means that foo function is owned by the object. So in this type of scenario, we can say the call site of the function is though the global object or the global scope, but we are taking the help of the containing object. So this time the JavaScript runtime decides that okay, if we are calling any function with the help of the containing object, then let's assign this object as a value of this. So this time the value of this is going to be the obj object, and that object is a property A, and that property has a value 2. That's why the 2 gets printed on the screen. Amazing. So in the previous slide, the call site was also global scope, but we are not taking the help of any containing object or the owning object. That's why the JavaScript runtime assigns the value of window to this keyword. Okay, but here as we are taking the help of the containing object, that's why the JavaScript engine assigns the value of this as the obj object. Okay, now let's see this example. In this example again, we have a same function, same object, but here we are doing something very interesting. So here we are accessing the obj.foo, and the whatever value the foo gives, we are assigning it to the bar. So this type of phenomenon, we call it implicit loss. Why implicit loss? Because first we are adding the function to object, and then we are accessing the function using obj, and then we are taking out that function from the object, and then we are storing the reference of that function in the bar variable. So which means now the reference of that function is stored in the bar as well as in the object, and then we are calling the bar. So you can see that this time we are taking out that function out of the object, and then we are calling at the root level of the script. So now what happens when we call the root level of the script? This time we do not have an containing or owning object. We are directly calling the bar, means we are directly calling the foo function. And what happens when we directly call it? The JavaScript engine decides that the value of this is going to be the global object. And what is the global object? It's a window object, and the window object has a value of A, which is defined here, and the value of that is oops global, which is why when we do console.log inside the foo, the oops global gets printed on the screen. Okay, so this is how the implicit binding of this keyword works. Now let's move on to next slide, where we will see how explicit binding of this keyword actually works. So here you can see that we have a function object. Similarly, we have a console log, we have a obj object. The obj object has A whose value is equal to 2. Now this time, instead of invoking the function foo directly or using the owning object, we are first accessing the call function of the function, and this call and apply is available to all the function, okay, in JavaScript. So we are accessing foo.call call, and then we are explicitly passing the obj object. So what does it mean explicitly? We are explicitly telling the JavaScript runtime, JavaScript engine, that please use the value of this as obj object. So in that case, the JavaScript engine assigns the obj object to the value of this, and then if the value of this is obj object, then it has a property, and the value of a property is 2, which is why the 2 gets printed on the screen. Amazing. This is how explicit binding works. So in implicit binding, we directly call the function on the root level of the script. In implicit binding, we use the containing or the owning object. In the explicit binding, we use the call and apply method of the function to explicitly passing the value of this. Okay, now let's understand the last rule. The last rule says that what happens when we call do a constructor call to any function. Okay, what happens in that case, and what will be the value of this case? So first we have to understand what happens when we do a constructor call to any function. So you can see that we have a foo function, and here we are doing a constructor call to this function. So let's understand what happens. So when we do a constructor call, 4 things happens. First, a brand new object is created out of thin air like this, and then the newly constructed object is prototype linked with the foo function. Okay, so here you can see that the object.setPrototype is setting up the prototype of this object, to the prototype of the foo function. And then the newly constructed object is set as the this binding for that function call. You can see that the third comment that the newly created object is set as a this value of the foo function call. And then in the last, if the foo function is not returning any alternate object, then the newly invoked function call will automatically return the newly constructed object, which means if we are not returning any alternate object from this foo function, then the newly created object will be by default returned by the JavaScript engine. As simple as that. This is what happens when we do a constructive call to a function. So in that case, when we do a new of foo by passing 2, then this refers to a newly created object. In that object, it will going to create a new property A, and the value of 2 will be assigned to that A. Then when we do bar.a, the value of 2 is going to be printed on the screen. As simple as that. So this is how the new binding of this keyword works. Alright, now we understand how default binding works, how implicit binding works, how explicit binding works, and how new binding of this keyword works. And we also know that how the call site impact the value of this keyword. Okay, so in real life, what you have to basically do, you just have to determine or figure out the call site of the function, and then you just have to apply the 4 rules of this binding. Okay, and as soon as you apply these 4 rules, you will be successfully able to determine the value of this. Nothing magical here and no rocket science here. Okay, now in the end, let's summarize whatever we have learned so far. So let's understand, if the function is called with the new binding, then the value of this is the newly constructed object. Okay, now if the function called with a call or apply, which means the explicit binding, in that case the value of this is equal to the explicitly specified object. As simple as that. Now what happens if the function is called with a context, which means a containing or the owning object? In that case, the value of this is equal to the containing or owning object. Okay, and in the last is the default binding. This default, what is the value of the this? If you are not running your script in a strict mode, then the value of this is the global object, which is a window. And if you are running your JavaScript code in a strict mode, then the value of this keyword is nothing but the undefined. So these are the only 4 rules you have to learn in order to become master at this keyword. Alright guys, this is all from my side for this video. If you learned something valuable from this video, then please hit the like button in order to make YouTube algorithm happy. Please subscribe to this channel and don't forget to click the bell icon so my friend you never miss any upcoming videos. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.